From Maitiyard's multiple applications to the Royal Literary Fund starting from the 1850s, I recover a broader story of how the period's changes in the press, which opened exciting avenues for some, plunged others into acute precarity. The early career of Frances Power Cobbe shows us the other side of the picture, a new phase of women's journalism, inaugurated by the mid-century expansion of what have been called high-repute periodicals. I examine her contributions to the first two such journals that published her work, Macmillan's Magazine and Fraser's Magazine, and demonstrate how she fashioned a new public image of the woman writer as a self-sustaining and influential political journalist. By publishing in these prestigious journals regularly, often in her own name, Cobbe not only earned a steady middle-class income amid stiff competition from university-educated men, but also acquired a high social standing as a political commentator. Cobbe's correspondence with her editors and other writers spread across the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the British Library, and the Huntington Library in California, reveal her formidable professional networks, sparkling wit, and superb negotiating abilities. I was especially thrilled to discover that she had prevailed over Macmillan's venerable editor, David Masson, in her very first Macmillan's piece, an article on women's contributions to workhouse reform. Returning her 16-page draft, Masson says she had to condense it. No more than 12 pages were allowed to, he says, even our most important papers. And adds, as if anticipating what she would try to pull, that he distinctly disliked the space-saving device of small print. Her published piece runs to 14 pages. And what's more, has 2 pages worth of small print. Yes, so my hunt for female foreign correspondents drew me to 3 pioneering assignments, which are here. First, Harriet Ward's coverage of the Seventh Frontier War for the United Service Magazine and Armed Services Monthly. Second, Harriet Martineau's reportage on post-famine Ireland for London's Daily News. And third, her transatlantic correspondence for the New York-based abolitionist weekly, the National Anti-Slavery Standard. Tracking these assignments also nudged me to rethink the genre of foreign and especially war correspondence grounds up. Ward's reportage of a colonial war for the Trans-Imperial Armed Services Monthly has none of the fast-paced information drive of newspaper war reports, which have been the focus of most scholarly studies of war correspondence. However, it shares their stress on first-person eyewitness accounts and meets other demands that the USM made of ethnographic detail and depth, of foregrounding military interests and perspective, of remediation and commentary on other press reports published in the colony and the metropole. Ward's letters to her editor, John Philippart, and publisher Henry Colburn, held at the Brenthurst Library in South Africa, provided crucial insights into the rhythms of colonial reportage, of waiting for the mail packet service, of addressing the overlapping imagined communities of a trans-imperial British United Service and the British civilian public, of guarding as best she could against loss in transit. Examining such specialized and neglected sites of war correspondence has crucial implications for our understanding of gender and genre in the Victorian press. It shows us, for example, that English female war reporters first emerged not in the civilian domains of daily newspapers, but startlingly in the masculine and militaristic avenue of an armed services monthly. And finally, I turn to fiction, examining a line of remarkable mid-century novels written by practicing female journalists that represent the woman of the press in striking detail and imaginative depth. The 4 main novels are in the slide here. The female journalist appears in these novels in several avatars, as a lowly penny-a-liner, a seasoned reviewer who cuts stupid novels down to size. Stupid are her words. She never misses a deadline. And also as an authoritative leader writer and an editor in command of a newsroom full of men. The risks and pleasures of press work for women are all evoked, and imaginative solutions are found to make it seem acceptable. New codes of feminine behavior are formulated, for example, to make women's cooperative, remunerative work with men in such mixed gender spaces as newspaper offices seem respectable. These novels also voice anxieties about what we now recognize as exploitation and sexual harassment at work and uncertain copyright provisions for journalists. They demand better pay and recognition for women writers. Crucially, they show the woman writers turning out the better for her encounter with the press, better fitted for wifehood or book writing or both, and in some cases, finding that nothing suited her better than leading her life as a single woman and successful journalist. These fictional models, I argue, emphasized the diversity and range of women's media writings and represented the professional claims of female journalists in the realm of fiction. I found the framework of the model particularly compelling as it allowed me to capture the exceptional and exemplary nature of this work, as well as these women's own self-representations as idealistic women journalists. Some of these women writers have attracted attention, particularly from historians of feminism, who have turned to their writings to trace the developing discourse of women's rights. My work is immensely indebted to this scholarship, especially for conceptualizing the political broadly, and I follow their lead in defining it as encompassing all the key social, economic, and public policy issues of the day. However, most of these studies approach the press as one among several means utilized by female activists and reformers to disseminate their views. The specific sites of periodical writing are mentioned, but rarely studied for how they shaped the writing itself. What they largely leave out was the story that I wanted to tell, which is how these strands of radical female writing shaped the wider professionalization of female authorship in the 19th century. For this story, it was also important to study reformist writers alongside others who took on forms of political reportage like foreign correspondence, which is not explicitly reformist in nature. By bringing together what is usually kept apart, women's political writing and feminist and general interest magazines, I found that the relation between the specialist and non-specialist press was not simply oppositional or competitive, but was also mutually sustaining. While earnings from the general magazines enabled women to write for specialist reform journals that paid little or nothing, unpaid journalism and campaign writing reinforced their credibility as socially concerned writers. Methodologically, studying how these model women were made by the press entailed recognizing the critical measure of authorial agency that Victorian women exercised while navigating the gendered constraints of social and political writing. So I drew up a kind of concept/method map, a squiggly version of Robert Dunton's communication circuit, I suppose, but adapted for the female journalist. To make it, I drew on the major conceptual work on authorship, the greatest hits, if you will, right from Barthes and Foucault's author function, Bourdieu, literary and cultural field, to the major interventions in Victorian periodical scholarship, the landmark 1989 theory issue of VPR and the 2015 return to theory issue, as well as the edited volumes and monographs by Joanne Shattock, Fionnuala Delan, Claire Petit, Linda Peterson, Alexis Easley, and several others. This map never made it to the book, but here it is. There's no time to elaborate on this, but as you can see, the map thickens one's sense of these women's journalistic practice. It keeps us in mind of the vast networks and varying relations of collaboration and competition in which these women worked. The constraints on authorial authority here are foundational, but not total. Attending to them helped me to attend better to the subjective end of these women's writings, to the individual strategies through which they took on the author function of serious political journalists, to how they seized opportunities on the fly. Just to give you one example of one such startling collaborative breakthrough, Cobb's Social Science Congresses and Women's Part in Them. It's a very well-known piece. A bit of context for this, for those who may not be familiar. When female members of the Social Science Association began to deliver their own papers at the organization's annual conferences, a wide range of journals tried to silence them by reinforcing the social stigma against women addressing a mixed-gender audience in public. In Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, for example, Joseph Bevington Atkinson compared the SSA's female speakers to dogs dancing on hind legs, going one better than Samuel Johnson's infamous comparison of women preaching to a dog walking on hind legs. And writing in defense of the SSA's female speakers, Cobb meticulously charts how it advances the organization's aims and helps social progress. So far, it's in line with the Macmillan's general way of writing. And then, the most startling part, however, is an extended satirical sketch of the male critics of female speakers as barking dogs. An inversion of Atkinson's jibe that pays him back in his own coin. Their writing, she says, is nothing but, and I quote, bow, wow, 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 wow. Unquote, And I was astonished to find that this is written into the pages of the famously serious Macmillan's magazine. This is no doubt a remarkable feat on Cobb's part, but one that resulted from a combination of factors. Macmillan's own support for women's issues, the topicality of the controversy, the fit of this piece within this issue of the journal, and the currency of such satirical jests within the press at the time. And finally, I want to talk about the book's engagement with the issue of signature. As various scholars have shown, the transition from anonymity to signature in the press was a remarkably uneven process, dependent on genre of discourse and type of periodical, and was itself the subject of intense debate. As women's relation to market success and celebrity continued to be problematic throughout this period, the anonymity of vast sections of the periodical press made it deeply attractive to female writers. The anonymous periodical essay, in Hilary Fraser and Daniel Brown's memorable phrase, was the Trojan horse that allowed women writers to enter the male preserve of professional writing. Following Barbara Onslow's groundbreaking Women of the Press in 19th Century Britain, and my own title is a hat tip to Onslow. Studies by Marissa DeMoore, Alexis Easley, Marianne van Remoutel, and others have significantly enhanced our knowledge of women's anonymous but influential careers as essayists, reviewers, and editors. However, at the same time as these women were making their surreptitious journeys to authority and influence, the model women of my study were foregrounding their social and political articles as women's writing. Some did so through signature, which they found worth risking for its promise of authorial eminence, for the chance to build a loyal and committed readership, and to fashion, discursively and in practice, new models of female professionalism. In a context where signature-using male journalists style themselves as upright salesmen and sportsmen, Dallas Little's work shows us, women like Frances Power Cobb highlighted the superior professional commitment and reliability of the signature-using female journalist, who relinquishes the special benefits that anonymity gave her as a woman. There were several others who, despite never identifying themselves individually, wrote on social and political issues under explicitly female personae. Harriet Ward, for example, filed her reports on the Seventh Frontier War as an anonymous army wife. By 1852, when Martineau traveled through Ireland as the Daily News' correspondent, she was so well known that she could not go far without being recognized and identified by name in the Irish and British press. For the celebrity woman journalist on a fieldwork assignment, anonymity was no guarantee of secrecy. The Irish press took the famed English celebrity writer to task. They contested what they called her jaundiced view, English view of Ireland. The Tralee Chronicle even commissioned their own correspondent to review areas covered by Martineau. In effect, one is witnessing a 4-page local Irish paper stand up to the mighty Martineau and the prestigious English Daily News, exposing their colonial bias. The episode suggests other promising new directions in which one could examine authority politics in the 19th century press. The study, I hope, will enable further inquiries into women's professional journalism. Some I know are already afoot. Laura Voracek's project on the Society of Women Journalists, whose database launched last year. Also Patrick Leary and the former current editors, Emily Middleton and Lars Atkins' work with Cobb's scrapbooks have made vast numbers of her anonymous leaders available for renewed study. I, for one, cannot wait to learn from these and other upcoming forays into the many, many model women who shaped and were shaped by the Victorian press. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Teja. And if you have questions for Teja, write them down. I'm going to have a discussion with them afterwards, but don't forget your questions. If you were thinking things that you would like to raise, please do note them. And if you've ever had your type shrunk when publishing an academic book, you can say you're just like Frances Powercop. Guilty as charged in my case. So I'm going to turn now to Andrew's wonderful book and the comments of our fellow judges, which Chris, who's here, will remember. Decades of meticulous research underpin this largely unknown account of the diversity, richness, and volatility of the British West Indian press and some of the most politically charged decades of the abolitionist campaigns. It foregrounds the fascinating role of the masterless Caribbean in shaping press culture. This remarkable and quietly revelatory book will be of significance to those working outside periodical studies, as well as promising to make an important contribution to media history. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Well, I blush. First of all, I need to say thank you to Caroline and to Teja for those generous comments, and also to the Society for inviting me here. I'm not an academic, I'm an archivist, so I'm certainly not used to speaking to audiences like this, so I hope you'll forgive any missteps along the way over the next 20 minutes or so. I've got some slides up on screen, which I won't be talking to. They're just there for some visual interest, so if you get bored of listening to me, that's where you can look. Anyhow, so here goes. There is, I think, a great deal which connects this book to the overall theme of this conference. Movements and migrations were essential to the very existence of a West Indian newspaper press in the early 19th century. Situated in what were mostly small reading communities in monocultures that relied on slavery, the West Indian press was distant from the basic means of newspaper production and totally dependent upon expensive imports of fixed and working capital. As well as importing the material tools of the printing trade, these newspapers relied heavily on flows of information arriving from abroad to bulk out their publications, with local news also departing outwards. West Indian editors exchanged files with brother editors in other islands, and they all freely used the contents of each other's papers, usually attributing source and date with scrupulous accuracy. There are signs that this West Indian newspaper exchange system may also have incorporated elements of the British press, the whole thing thus comprising a vast, slow-moving transatlantic circulation of news. The system was surprisingly efficient given the limitations of the time, but there were, of course, the unavoidable effects of the temporal disjunction caused by the tyranny of distance, which still ruled supreme at this time. Widespread use of steamships was still some way off, submarine telegraphs even more so. In essence, everything printed in the West Indies was immediately out of date from the perspective of the officials at the Colonial Office and other interested parties in Britain. A basic fact of life, which also applied to private letters and the governor's correspondence and official papers dispatched in the official bag, as it was called, that went via the scheduled sailing packets, which took 6 to 8 weeks to cross the Atlantic. It can thus be argued that people in the colonies and in the metropole existed in timelines that were completely out of sync. The importance of this factor in shaping historical events is something we perhaps underestimate in our instantaneous world today. In addition to material supplies and information, there was also movement of newspaper personnel between the colonies and from Britain and North America. Now, one might reasonably expect this in the 18th century, given the general state of underdevelopment of the British West Indies at the time. But there are examples of itinerant newspapermen from throughout the 19th century, a trend that becomes marked as the advance of professionalism in Britain registered in the colonies. In the later 19th century, we have a number of cases of professional British journalists with CVs taking in many British titles, travelling across the Atlantic to take up positions in Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guyana. So, I hope that the author of British West Indian newspapers and the abolition of slavery can show his face at this gathering without disgrace. But the title of our session is Authority, Politics and the 19th Century Press, New Directions. So how does the book relate to that? So far as New Directions in research goes, it provides the first overview of early 19th century British West Indian newspapers and potted biographies of some of the people who owned, edited, printed and published them. The work is not entirely novel. Whose is? I did find fragmentary references to West Indian newspapers in the historiography as far back as the 1910s, but these were mostly tangential remarks relating to individual papers, of limited use when considering the regional development of the press as a whole. Consequently, much of the book is based on primary sources, and not just newspapers self-reporting themselves. The use of official and private correspondence, reports, dispatches, and so forth from various archives means that it is, dare I say, a groundbreaking work, as no one to my knowledge has attempted a regional history of the British Caribbean press. The book is, of course, merely the first word on the subject, and it touches more heavily on the press of some colonies than others. So there is potentially much scope to add to what I have written, or indeed to challenge it and to show where I am in error. So too with the biographies which the book provides of many of the larger-than-life personalities involved with the press. I added a little more to the ongoing accumulation of data on a couple of very well-known newspapermen from Jamaica, and I also managed to rescue some individuals from hitherto complete historical obscurity. I explored in detail many of the heated controversies involving these people and their newspapers, but there is always more to add in terms of detail and interpretation, and I hope that future research will prove fruitful in that regard. One of the things which the book does is to posit a political newspaper spectrum unique to the West Indian press of the period, and this is where things get interesting in terms of that word authority. Towards one end of that spectrum, let's call it the progressive end, with all of the caveats that come when historically applying 21st century notions of progressive ideas, towards one end sat a small group of liberal newspapers that outraged the dominant white colonial population by campaigning for the civil and political rights of the free-colored population and also seeking the abolition of slavery. And the term free-colored may have a slightly jarring note for some modern ears. It was freely used by contemporaries and is used here for the sake of convenience. It basically means free people of mixed race living within the slave economy. Scattered at various points towards the other end of the spectrum were the newspapers which are still best described collectively as the planter press. Traditional term used in the literature and one used in this book, albeit in a heavily qualified way, as it is overly reductive. There was plenty in between these two poles, and political positions were not fixed. And the book shows how the newspaper landscape in the Caribbean at this time was more complex and fluid than has been previously thought. For example, we have the white-owned Antigua Free Press vigorously campaigning for the abolition of slavery to the near ruin of its owner come editor, and the St. George's Chronicle from Grenada lining up in the pro-slavery camp despite being owned by a free man of color. I attempt to understand and interpret these phenomena, and there are other surprising newspaper curios like these detailed in the book. The relationship between newspapers and local and international politics is a key theme. What this book is heavily concerned with is the role of a couple of politically assertive newspapers that first emerged towards the back end of the 1820s, owned, edited, printed and published by free men of colour. And as an aside, the St. Kitts Advertiser was part owned at this time by a mixed race woman. West Indian societies in this period were highly stratified, and politics was electrically charged around the subject of race. And the appearance of muscular, free-coloured owned newspapers inevitably met with opposition from the vast majority of colonial whites who refused to accept point blank that these were legitimate print vehicles articulating the aspirations of a class of people who were viewed as socially inferior and subject to all manner of legal and political discrimination. That stubborn refusal to accept the authoritative status of these newspapers manifested itself in many ways, in physical violence and regular attacks via a judicial system that was riven with corruption. And there were also concerted economic tactics designed to destroy the precarious profitability of the business models which underpin these papers. Advertising boycotts and the withholding or cancellation of official printing contracts were all employed to try and sabotage the newspapers of Henry Loving of Antigua and Edward Jordan of Jamaica. These two men of colour were among the most important West Indian newspapermen in their day, certainly the most infamous in pro-slavery circles. So that briefly touches on the issue of contested authority for the free coloured-owned newspapers that emerged in the later 1820s. A word or two on the majority of white-owned newspapers from that time, print businesses which, simply by dint of being owned by white people, one might expect not to have faced questions of authority. Their legitimate status would have come naturally, as it were. In fact, there were numerous conflicts involving these papers, and the book touches on many of these as an illustrative counterpart to the controversies involving the free-coloured and anti-slavery papers. The key point here is that the West Indian colonies at this time were oligarchies in miniature, and authority in oligarchies is the prerogative of the oligarchs themselves, or at least that's how they like to think of it. Put simply, in the British West Indies at this time, there were elites within elites, and those at the top had no hesitation whatsoever in persecuting those lower down the scale who were perceived to have transgressed in some way. Needless to say that obstreperous journalists were prime targets, and just as with the papers owned by free people of colour, we have numerous examples of warped prosecutions for libel in the courts and much cruder attempts at intimidation, physical violence, threats to property, and so on. Thinking on all of this turbulence, together with the sheer grind of getting anything into print on a regular basis in the colonial context, the fact that any independent newspapers managed to exist in such circumstances is, I sometimes think, little short of astonishing. Well, astonishing to me or not, many of these newspapers were prominent fixtures embedded within the rhythm of weekly life, their editors often local celebrities, and publication day eagerly awaited by the reading public. There are many aspects of their historical importance which I could mention here, not least the crowning issue of whether newspapers shaped the tumultuous political developments of the emancipationist period to a significant degree, or were essentially passive agents that were formed by wider events. I'll leave that circular argument for another day. Instead, I would like to talk about the question of readership, because as well as being of historical importance, I think that it relates directly to the questions we're considering in this session. Although we do have some circulations figures culled from various sources, which I have to say all sound suspicious to me, but I did include them in the book, circulation is obviously not the same as readership. And with regard to the latter, we're largely reliant on some basic intuition. The most aggressive of the pro-slavery newspapers found a large audience among those oligarchs, the leading planters and merchants, and their hangers-on, who dominated local life and had an obvious stake in preserving slavery. Some of the more timid pro-slavery publications also had long lifespans, and therefore, presumably, solid readership bases, while the newspapers owned by free people of colour almost certainly had a sufficiently deep pool of subscribers drawn from that particular group. But these were minority groups within societies that were deeply unbalanced demographically. What of the slaves? The slaves, after all, were a massive majoritarian presence in all of the British West Indian colonies, and life there would have collapsed without their coerced labour. What was the relationship between the West Indian press and the slaves? Well, the relationship can be traced, in my view, only in faint outline, but it certainly existed. The simple presence of the slave population undoubtedly influenced the contents of the press. Advertisements for slave runaways were common, and the question of abolition was endlessly discussed as the 1820s wore on. But there is more to it than this. We have strong anecdotal evidence of newspapers in the emancipationist period being read to slave audiences at under-the-radar subversive events, and some editors even printed rather incongruous open letters addressed directly to the slaves. Now, an individual slave or a group of illiterate slaves seeking to access and release information from the prison of the printed page can, it seems to me, only be considered as a direct political challenge to the existing structures of colonial authority. And although the evidence needs to be handled with care, the heavily mediated accounts that are available convince me that the West Indian press and British newspapers, which also circulated in the islands, had a definite but wholly inadvertent hand in stoking the great revolts that shook the West Indian colonies in the final period of slavery. Barbados, 1816, Demerara, 1823, Jamaica, 1831-32. And if some of those involved in these massive insurgencies consciously used newspapers in their planning, might not other smaller acts of sabotage also have been prompted, if only indirectly, by, say, an intemperate editorial that had somehow passed into the pool of common knowledge? To draw these brief remarks together, I would say that the essential point of my book is that the first third of the 19th century was a formative period in which a newspaper press that was distinctly West Indian in character emerged in the region, growing out of, or outgrowing, depending on how you want to look at it, a British tradition of polemical writing in newspapers. One thing above all else lay behind this development: the complex processes whereby slavery was rendered untenable and finally abolished. Although differing in certain respects, this was basically the shared experience of all of Britain's West Indian possessions. Despite being arguably more hypothetical than real in some ways, the process and the event of abolition was still a profound change that was crucial to the development of the colony's newspapers. Accordingly, a clutch of highly flavoursome titles largely defined the pre- and immediate post-abolition newspaper scene in the West Indies. The Jamaica Courant, the Barbadian, the Watchman in Jamaica, the Guyana Chronicle, Port of Spain Gazette, Free Press and Weekly Register in Antigua, and the Free Press and St. George's Chronicle in Grenada all helped to create the basic template for the later 19th century West Indian newspaper as a politicized and highly opinionated print vehicle, usually dominated by a singular, indeed often overbearing individual. Post-abolition, the titles mentioned above were soon to be joined by noisy newcomers, such as the Liberal in Barbados, the Palladium in St. Lucia, and the Dominican. All three, incidentally, owned, edited, printed, and published by highly articulate men of colour who were no strangers to movement and migration back and forth across the Atlantic and between the colonies. Other competitive papers appeared elsewhere as the century wore on. Many seem little more than unprepossessing scraps of badly printed paper, but they too were capable of generating local political controversies which had a histrionic feel that was distinctly familiar to what had gone before. The history of the West Indian newspaper press post-1834 has yet to be researched in the detail which it deserves. In particular, the role of the press during the so-called apprenticeship period of 1834-38 would be worth examining. The die-hard planter papers, which, as with the readers they served, had forgotten nothing and learnt nothing, remained completely unreconciled to the historic landmark of 1834. Their defeat over abolition produced the bitterest gall that not even financial compensation to the tune of £20 million could sweeten. And a study of the West Indian press covering the rest of the century might help to rescue the unfair reputation of the region as a backwater of empire worthy of notice only when shaken by violent events such as the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865. After all, The region was not a backwater to the people who lived there. And in finally closing, you'll be glad to hear, I would like to add a brief tribute to my co-prize winner. What strikes me about Teja's book is how its radical difference to my own work demonstrates the vitality of the field in which we work. Newspapers and periodicals are unlike any other historical documents. As both source and subject, they seem capable of bearing any number of methodological approaches. To name just one that Teja writes about with great insight, the issue of anonymity versus signature and the potential offered by both to the pioneering women who are the focus of her work. Now, the idea of strategically deployed anonymity was new to me, and it caused me to think again about the largely unsigned material I worked through in my own research. For example, were any of those letters deploring slavery that were published in pro-abolition newspapers written by colonial whites, secretly hoping to see its end? I don't know. But I do know that this kind of intellectual stimulation can only be a good thing. And it is, I would suggest, one of the reasons we're all here. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm going to move to questions. I should say my speakers don't know what I'm going to ask them. We didn't want this to feel too rehearsed. So, there might be a few surprises here coming out of the discussions that we've had. But two wonderful papers. One thing that they do have in common is an absolutely rigorous attention to evidence, archives, subtlety, not overstating cases, complexity, and your books were really characterized by that. And one of the things that the judges loved was your careful, meticulous, rigorous scholarship and your amazing use of archives. So many archives in both of your books. One of the things I wanted to ask, actually, you had your diagram there, Teja, of the author in situ. So thinking about, where we are now in this era of contested histories, culture wars, rise of nationalist populism in, UK, India, the States, you both make a really strong case for, archival research, careful scholarship, evidence and fact-checking. Could you speak a little bit about, as situated, writers of these books, why that careful, meticulous research was so vital to you, and what challenges you actually faced in the archives?
Well, as I mentioned, I am an archivist, so it came very easily and naturally to me to approach the archives, which I used for this book, in that way. In my day job, as it were, we treat every collection at Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives with the same respect and the same careful attention to detail. So it just felt very natural to me to work in that way. And 35 years ago, goodness me, when I started the research for that, the supervisor who oversaw my work just inculcated good habits. It was just, you've spent time in the archives and you plowed through it all and you read it, and he wouldn't have let anything past. It was a loose statement, or I don't know, some foolish kind of youthful nonsense that I may have articulated. He would have not had that, I can assure you. So it was just, dare I say, I was schooled in it.
Here's so literary scholars take note. This is a historian.
Yeah.
not that I want to start any kind of disciplinary wars. Teja, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. So actually, I was thinking about this question of, it's really sort of, there's so many ways of thinking about this, and perhaps one of that is disciplinary. I completely get and I share the sense of excitement that opens up when one actually finds something in the archive and one can trace it. But a lot of it is also, some of it is not serendipitous in that we know that the archives exist at a particular point. So for example, for Girton College, because it is Girton College and they keep their archives very, very well catalogued and so on. So it's also about different kinds of experiences with the archives, whereas others could be, we may not even know that they exist, or sometimes it's uncatalogued. I remember we had this conversation. So one is really going in there without knowing what one, and sometimes one doesn't find. Like there were in the, so there was this one letter that wasn't a letter, it was a scrap from a letter that remained in the Bodleian Library. I think the other part of, yeah, it's gone. So, but they had catalogued what the letter belonged to. So it's sort of varying degrees of sufficiency that one works with. And I was also thinking that there's also a bit of, I think there is perhaps value in sort of staying alive to the fact that we're still working with a partial sense of what is there. And sometimes like the archive can also make it important to sort of learn things on the fly. So I remember with the Mary Howitt letters, some of them are not dated, so at all. And they were at the time quite uncatalogued. So to date them, I would look for like Christmas greetings. So because it only ran for a year and a half, so then only one Christmas really. So, so that kind of thing. Sometimes you sort of go internal for the clues. Yeah, it's a bit like sleuthing, really.
Yes, I love that. I've heard that story before, and I love that. That's classic. As an archivist, I just think that's wonderful.
I wanted to ask a little bit about this idea of the illicit, under the radar. You had your wonderful diagram that I mentioned there, network diagram. But you're also, Andrew, linking this to a population who isn't necessarily literate, but you have a range of subversive agents in the book. I love the slave compositors. I think because I'm the daughter of a compositor. I just like these subversive figures who are potentially giving slave, kind of audiences information from newspapers. So thinking about diagrams and networking diagrams, or, circuits, as it used to be with Dante, and you've moved towards a network kind of model there. I wanted to ask both of you, whether you felt it was tricky to grapple with these kind of under-the-radar power struggles. How do we get at these ideas of struggles for power, whether it's Cobb struggling to get an extra page in Macmillan's, or whether it's a slave audience struggling to access news? I mean, and I don't have an answer to this. It's a selfish question, but, was anything useful to you thinking about this? Was it really key for you to have that idea of the struggle in your books? Maybe Teja, do you want to start?
Yes, so I was just thinking of the Englishwoman's Journal, for example, which if you were to only read the journal, you would get no sense of just how much struggle was going on. And it could be quite everyday things. So one of my favorites is Eliza Maiteyard sent something directly to the printer. And the editor was not happy, and they said, the trouble with these professional writers is that they think they know, everything, So there's this, so it's interesting to think of like the editor, writer, even with, deeply, they all believe in the same things and, largely hold the same principles. But that does not mean that the day-to-day functioning is going to go smoothly at all. So I came across a lot of these power struggles actually even within the core team. So the other one I remember was when, Bessie Rayner Parkes is the editor, and one specific issue, there's just a lot of France. And she says, really, you need to hold off on the France. Because if the material is coming from, core team, and then also the proprietor of the journal, and then the proprietor's husband is also sending in something on France. And she's like, I can't. So there's some kind of, real struggle happening in terms of keeping the overall balance of that specific issue. But also I was thinking that I was actually there was one thing that really, vis-a-vis this issue of like negotiating authority. When Eliza Metiat starts writing for Douglas Jerrold's weekly newspaper, and that's where the pseudonym Silver Pen, comes about. Now, at one point, she does send an article to the Weekly Dispatch, which was being used very well by some other women writers at the time. Alexis Easley has written about this. Now, so it must have been attractive to her. And then what I was really struck by is that there's a letter from Mary Howitt, which says, well, we have had to handle the situation of you sending a Silver Pen article that Douglas Jerrold wanted to, Weekly Dispatch. And I was thinking, well, that's her article and her name, like she can send it to. But clearly there was this sense of proprietary attitude to where they thought, who had the first right of publication? It's that kind of power struggle. And then William Howitt and Mary Howitt have to come in and smooth matters between them so that, relations are not affected and publishing chances are not affected. So I was quite struck by that.
Yeah,
yes.
that's really, really interesting example. And it kind of links in nice ways. I remembered a phrase in your book, illicit networks appears, I think, where you're kind of nuancing that term and maybe even suggesting network just doesn't do the business of getting at this idea of struggle. Could you elaborate a bit more on struggle and that desire to really get across in your book a real struggle for power?
Well, the West Indian colonies of the 1820s and 30s simmered with latent violence, and the press was fully part of that. And in terms of the slave population, they wanted freedom, and I think they were going to get it, basically. And the press just happened to be one of the mechanisms which they were using to achieve that goal. And it was illicit. The evidence is mediated, obviously, because it's all written by white people. But I think it's overwhelming. And I think we have to accept that these reader audience events were going on. They took place. And the way I think of it is that who knows what that information, how that could have changed in the movement from the printed page through the intermediary, whose command of English, whose theatricality, all sorts of things come into play, and then it goes out into the audience. What do they then do with it? I think we can say fairly safely that they do take it away and they sharpen it, as it were, in their own minds, in their own struggle for freedom and self-liberation, for want of a better expression. But I think it was going on. It's just, I always feel the evidence is just over the horizon somewhere, just never quite.
But you do a really good job at tracking down those elusive, bits of historical material, which is really, really fascinating. I think struggle, sabotage in the history of the press is a really fascinating thing, actually. And linking maybe to that slightly, I wanted to ask you both about time, actually, in your books. In your paper there, I think the phrase timelines out of sync came up, Andrew, and temporal disjunction. Teja, you write in very fascinating ways about Harriet Ward, in South Africa, mailbags going awry, as you mentioned there. But also, there's the link there between the books that there's no submarine telegraphs in the Caribbean when in the period that you're writing about, Andrew, and there's optical telegraphs, I think, that Harriet Ward is relying on here. I'm thinking about some of the recent work here around what's happening in the press. Andrew Griffith's work on the Anglo-Zulu War in The Friend of India, where he makes quite an interesting argument about the fact that communication streams break down news breaks down is a source of creativity and political creativity. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit about that idea of time, potentially the breakdown of news networks as well, and whether, the idea of transnational networks or, transnational or imperial information flows really get at this very interesting issue that you both raise around temporal disjunction, as you nicely put it. Andrew, do you want to start, Andrew?
Well, I'm not sure I can put it any other way than I put it in the paper. That they just existed in different timelines. So a number of the editors I wrote about ended up in jail flung into jail for various transgressions. And then there was this process whereby they would petition the governor, who, if he was a planter's governor, it would go to the bottom of the in tray. Nothing would get done. He then had, the bloke in jail would then have to petition the imperial government. And there's this great long 6 weeks to get over the Atlantic, 6 weeks to get back, plus the time at the colonial office where they were all sat around thinking about, how do we deal with this? So there is this, it's almost like two separate histories, as it were, going on. And eventually they kind of join in a single timeline, as it were. But it's much farther down the track, especially for the poor man who's in a West Indian jail cell. And that was no joke at the time, was it? So, sorry, I've drifted off point now.
It's fascinating.
I told you I'm not an academic.
So, yes, actually, it does. So there's just two ways in which I was thinking about this. One is to think of timeliness as a highly relative concept, and that it depends on, of course, the reader's own sense of time, but also the time that they expect information to be updated within a specific journal. And in the trans-imperial circuit, topicality played a huge role because there was just no way in which things could get updated very quickly within those channels of communication. So, for example, in the USM, which was published out of London, it was definitely read in London, but given that there is some evidence to suggest that some military mess rooms had them, it could have very well have had a readership in the various imperial spaces, though there's no hard and fast evidence for that. But the point is that it still had to be readable even within London after about at least 2 months. Now, so in the book, I actually go into this and what serializing war really entails and how it works with topicality as a concept. Because topicality stretches your notion of the present. And these are all coverages of present wars, but they work with an enormous time lag. So one of the things that I found was that because these channels of communication, and absolutely, they anticipated that sometimes things would get lost in transit. Now, if that is the case, I found this one letter that Ward sends, and she's just dashing this really because the next packet service is going to leave the Cape. And she says, I've enclosed a duplicate of my first chapter and also then the 6th chapter. And I thought, but a duplicate of your second chapter, this is a bit late, like that ship has sailed, So, and it's true actually, there was no way the duplicate would have made it. But I think this was essentially a way that she was doing the best that she could to sort of, it basically tells you something about that anxiety about loss in transit. And the other thing which this required was actually a very alert editor. So after several months, she writes and says, in that letter, I got the number of casualties completely wrong. Some hundreds, but it should be thousands were made hundreds or hundreds were made thousands. And she says, actually, in page number 6, I think I had the right figure. I hope you caught this in time, I was like, you know, and then I checked the published version and he had caught it. You know, so I was like, so it required enormous coordination between like editor, reporter, and sometimes I guess, you know, I mean, if errors crept in, then people also knew how to read with those errors. I mean, they made a margin of error was sort of accounted for.
That's really great. And
yes.
actually, one of the things that's quite interesting is that you recover Harriet Ward in really interesting ways around an issue of time, partly, don't you? Because, I mean, we look often for the foreign correspondent in the daily newspaper, and you show us a different temporal rhythm with her, and that actually she's pioneering, but we were looking at the wrong time, you know, period for the news, you know, the particular periodical that we were looking at. So there's lots of fascinating things. I could go on forever, but I want to hand over to you as an audience. I can come back in, but I'm sure you do have questions. So if you have a question for either of our speakers, do raise your hands. There's a roving mic, I believe.
There is, because there's no thing in the middle, so Mary will be on one side, I'll be on the other. Caroline, you will call on people, we'll just hand out mics. May I please ask, as you ask your question, would you say your name, please? So we have lots of young new folks here, and if you happen to be Fionnuala Delane, who was cited, tell people that you're Fionnuala Delane.
Hi, thanks a lot and congratulations for the prize. My name is Marie-Léger Saint-Jean, and as my name suggests, I'm going to ask a question about language. I noticed, Andrew, during your talk, there was a newspaper from St. Lucie. And so how did you incorporate the multilingualness of the Caribbean and Antilles?
The St. Lucia paper was a bit of an exception. I'm glad you spotted it. It's there deliberately. I don't know if people are familiar with the history of St. Lucia. Sorry, I've got to talk about military history now, because it was one of those chess pieces in the Caribbean that was back and forth between the British and the French in the 1790s and 1810s. Demographically, it was French. Well, I think even down to the present day, there is a strong French influence in culture. And that particular newspaper was published in French by a Frenchman who lived under British rule. St. Lucia had a tradition of censorship of the press, well, French censorship of the press in the 1810s, 20s, and so on. And in fact, that slide you saw up there was the last ever issue. It came to grief in 1830, and in the National Archives, that was the only one I was able to find. So I used it basically as an example of how the press in St. Lucia, which was what was called one of the Crown colonies, was relatively limited. It didn't have much. It didn't really compare to some of the more aggressive, assertive newspapers in the British Islands. And it didn't manage to last, unfortunately. So.
Hi there. Hi, I'm David Finkelstein. It's been a pleasure to listen to both of you and to hear about your work. It's been fantastic. And I had a question. I want to go back to the question of networks. I was really intrigued, obviously, by the idea of illicit networks, but I wondered if there was another set of networks that I don't know if your books address. One's professional networks. I'm sure, Teja, you were looking at that in terms of women and the way that they circulated. And you think about the late 1880s and 1890s, Joan Shattuck's written about this, about the clubs that rise, women's clubs that are specifically about trying to get journalists and women in the press to link together. But for Andrew, there's another area I wondered if it had come across in your work, which is the production space, the printing shops. That would have been, there have been very few of them, I can imagine, working throughout the West Indies, so that a number of newspapers might have emanated from the same source, using the same print personnel. That is not just the editors, but the actual print shop whose individuals might have then maybe surreptitiously run off things for a number of groups that might have been partial to their interests. Has that cropped up at all? Would that have been something that would have featured? Because that would have been another interesting, would be like economic print network that would have enabled newspapers to have come out in a way that might have reached audiences that you wouldn't have thought about. Did that come through? So those two questions, if you like, networks in one way and networks in another. So.
Thank you for that question. Actually, yes. Just very quickly, so there was, of course, exactly, so there's the professional networks which are easier to identify, but also I was thinking of the periodical as a space that then foregrounds a certain kind of network and creates networks between ideas, people who might otherwise not be put together in that space, and then generates thinking of them as networked. Actually, and also I was really struck when I was working with the English Women's Journal that sometimes these networks are also invented. So for example, there's this one letter that cropped up suddenly out of nowhere because they have faint, right, not very much on India. And then suddenly one Mr. Purushottam Das showed up, and he's saying, you are wonderful, please also help our benighted sisters, and, things like this. And, and they say, we have a massive, like, this is obviously being done to suggest that they have a lot of interest in India and that they have this global reach. And then this Purushottam Das also calls himself, and they call him Esquire. And then when I looked at historical scholarship on this, Esquire was just not a title that would have been given to him. So my hunch is that this was just made up, but also published, But the other way in which networks were also foregrounded, I thought, was with the Emigration Society, for example, that one of the core members was involved in. When they get attacked in a Brisbane newspaper, there is one of their own in Australia who then writes back in the Brisbane newspaper and, defending them. And this entire exchange is then reprinted in the English Women's Journal. So it's also a way of saying we have your back. Like if you join us, then there's also this continued support that is being provided to them. So I thought that was quite interesting. Andrew, did you want to?
So the idea of print in office networks, very interesting. As far as I can tell, each newspaper in each of the islands had its own office. They didn't share facilities, as far as I can tell. They sometimes swapped personnel. There's no doubt about that. And the other thing, Caroline spoke about this, the compositors in the West Indian newspaper offices, some of whom in the pre-1834 period were slaves. And there's at least one case that I know of where one of the compositors smuggled copies out of the office and was caught, and you can imagine what happened next. Severe punishments, because you've got these societies which are brutal and brutalizing. They rely on extreme levels of security to maintain their kind of structure, if you will, and yet they allow these newspapers to float about almost willy-nilly. It's quite strange. It's a paradox I've never really been able to resolve in my own mind. But there's no question that compositors did smuggle copies of newspapers out, thus initiating those illicit networks which you mentioned. No question about it.
And there is wonderful stuff in the book actually about the cost of paper and print and how type gets that. You'll love this book. I'm not on commission here, David, but it'll be right up your street. There's the diagrams of prices, of, there's real kind of social, economic history of physical infrastructure, isn't there? So networks, I suppose, looking at people in the audience who use the term networks, or I've been thinking about networks recently, it can mean everything and nothing, can't it? And so actually trying to give some nuance to what we mean when we say network is a really fascinating question, which we've been debating a little bit. Question at the front, I think. Thank you.
perhaps for both of you, but Andrew, I noticed the Struggler, 1830 Struggler, I believe it's called, the newspaper, and it was 1830, and it came out of Dublin, actually Leeson Street, Dublin. I'm not sure what it was on. I couldn't quite read it. So the question, and perhaps it's about the Irish question, is what role did news from Ireland play in the Caribbean? And I noticed that the Martineau letter was letters from Ireland, 1854, 52, super, right? So super interesting. So those are both, Catholic emancipation, 1829, and the Young Ireland stuff, maybe. But so in terms of the Caribbean, parliamentary reform, independence, independence, and what's the other one? Well, if there was any thought about the Irish struggle in coming through the paper, or something about that particular newspaper.
That particular newspaper is, it was called The Struggler. It was published in Jamaica by, I think it was financed by a man of color, a man called John Manderson, but I think it was edited and printed by a Jewish Londoner, and there's a long, long history of a Jewish presence in the Jamaican press. And what was his name? Alexander Oppenheim, I think. Sorry, memory's being what it is. I can't recall exactly. Whether the Irish struggle ever really appeared in the 1830s, I suspect not. I don't recall ever reading anything about it. I think they were too busy being concerned with their own political problems. There are interesting, slightly later connections with Ireland. There was a man who worked in Barbados called Samuel Jackman Prescott, and he had connections with O'Connell. And I've recently found on the British Newspaper Archive, the gift that keeps on giving, as I'm sure you know, collections in the West Indies, in Jamaica and Dominica, for famine relief. So, not huge sums of money by any means, but, significant enough to make it into Irish newspapers that they acknowledged this. But 1830s, I'm not so sure. I mean, I'd have to go back and have a look. Of course, when I was doing my stuff, I wasn't actually looking for that, was I? So it may have crept in and crept by my attention.
Time for one more question, if we have one. I might. Is there one? Yes. Great.
Hi, thank you both for your excellent talks and I assume excellent books. I look forward to reading them. My name is Vic Clark. I had a question about this idea of the role of anonymity and pseudonymity. And I thought that both of your talks touched on those in really interesting ways, but also on this idea of communal readerships and that idea of circulation and readership being different questions. So I wondered if you saw in your kind of authorship and readership communities, is there any sense of this kind of anonymous writers speaking to anonymous readers, or how that anonymity or pseudonymity is used to address these kind of hidden readerships?
Thank you, Vic. So just to address, it's interesting because I come at this question from the other side, which is actually foregrounding identity and female identity. But I was thinking, thinking with you, and I was thinking of this one of the most controversial letters that comes up, a letter from a reader in the English Woman's Journal, which is by this person who calls herself the West End housekeeper. And it's really controversial, and it's almost written to provoke a response. And then it goes on and on and on. Well, she's saying essentially that, oh, why do they not work? Why do the lower middle class women just not work as household labor? Because really, like, they're not born and bred ladies. You know, it's obviously controversial. But it goes on, and there is editorial correspondence, which is that they're having a bit of a laugh about it, which makes me wonder if one of them wrote that to provoke this long list of, you know, correspondence. But about, the question was also about how they were talking to each other, or how they were anticipating. Sorry.
How are they kind of anticipating different types of readership? So potentially women who were getting this, in your case, women readers who are perhaps getting these journals second or third hand, so they wouldn't have been counted in the original circulation, but these kind of invisible readerships.
Yes, I mean, that would, it varies across the journals, but I was also thinking specifically about because you asked about anonymity, so I'm thinking about the anonymous army wife, for example. And she writes as one of their community because there's a clear self-fashioning as army wife, which is a specific kind of identity, which has a link to the occupational identity of the husband. And she also, her father is also a services person. So she speaks as one from the community to the core readership, which is from the armed services, but also to the civilian public as speaking from within the community. So yes, so there's ways in which people are anticipating resistance and then dealing with that and how they create these personae. Yes.
I think anonymity with the newspapers I looked at is just so, I need to go back and think more about this, frankly. Most of the contents of the newspapers I looked at were anonymous. There was never any signed letters, articles, anything of that type. And yet, the phrase I use in the book is that the man was the paper and the paper was the man. So an individual's name or a company's name, sometimes if they were partnerships, they would be in the masthead, and I think they were there for legal reasons, so that if they ever were dragged through court, and it happened a lot, you know, you had somebody to blame, you had somebody to prosecute. But the body of the text that comprised each edition was by and large anonymous, and that was their get out of jail card. So when they were in court, you know, there's these endless discussions about how can you prove authorship. Legally, I'm not sure you can, even though it says published by Edward Jordan. He would say, no, I was out of town, nothing to do with me. No, it's true, he did. It's quite comical in a way, but he did. And very quickly, in terms of different readerships, they sent their papers out once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week in certain cases. The control was immediately lost once it left the printing office. And there were readerships, illicit readerships, we come back to that word again, that were making full use of these, certainly in the West Indies, full use of these things, and I dare say in India and elsewhere. The whole thing was uncontrolled. That's what I always think about, this paradox I mentioned earlier about the West Indies, that here you have these awful societies in many ways, regimented, brutally controlled, and yet they have this cuckoo in the nest, the newspapers, that just cause such problems with these illicit anonymous readerships.
So. A wonderful point to end a discussion. I think I'd like to thank 2 wonderful speakers. I think Routledge will be doing well after this. Lots of people going away to get these books. I mean, in the era of undisciplining Victorian studies, we've got 2 disciplines here, no fights, a really fascinating discussion, and really methodological, fascinating things. I've learned so much from both reading your books and just hearing you today. So can I thank our speakers, please, Teja and Andrew. They deserve a glass of wine, I believe.